We're going to talk about some basic photo editing techniques. We're going to go to File, Open. We're going to select our picture and then make sure down here in the format that we're on Camera Raw. And then we'll click Open. That's going to open our picture up in a sub-program of Adobe Photoshop called Camera Raw. And over here there are a few things to notice. We have some tools up here like crop and white balance, an adjustment brush tool. And over here we have some main adjustments that we can make to the entire picture. So this picture, for example, is, first of all, it's too dark, and second of all, it has kind of a bluish hue on it. So we can adjust the brightness of the picture with this exposure toggle. And what you notice is as I drag the exposure, these little mountain looking things in the histogram are moving back and forth. Once stuff is going up the right side of this histogram, that means that it's getting so bright that it is losing all of its color information and it's just going to straight white. If we slide it back on the other side, when things are going up this left side, it means that it's so dark that it's lost all its color information and it's just going straight to black. What we want is we want for as much of the color to be over on this right hand side as we can have without stuff crawling up and getting whited out. Now to take down some of these things that have gotten too bright, and you can click on this arrow and it'll show you, it's mostly some little white spots on the shirt. And that's okay because the main thing is that the faces are properly exposed. If there's a little bit of blowout on some of the clothing, as long as it's not too much, it's something that we could probably live with. Now, as I said before, this photo also has kind of a blue tint on it. We can change the temperature, make it colder, or we can make it warmer. So since it started off with kind of a blue tint, we're going to make it a little bit warmer until we get more natural colors. Another way to do this is to use the white balance tool and select something that is white in the picture. We click on that, and that calibrates everything according to what we say is white. And I happen to think that that's a little bit too bright or a little bit too warm. You can also change the tint here if the colors that you're seeing on the faces, if they seem a little bit too red or orange, you can pull the tint towards the green side. If they seem a little bit too greenish, then you can pull it a little bit towards the magenta side. If you go too far, obviously, you're going to wind up with some weird things going on. So we're going to pull it until it looks about normal. So we've adjusted our exposure and our temperature and tint. Another thing that we can do is either add or subtract from the contrast. In this case, we'll just add a little bit of contrast. Adding too much contrast obviously makes things just a little bit too bright and hard to look at. I'm going to take the contrast down to about right here. We've got some highlights, as we saw before, some things crawling up the right side of this histogram. We can actually drag those down where the only thing that's getting darker are the highlights, and the rest of the picture is not going to get darker. We're going to drag the highlights down a little bit to try and reduce what is what's getting blown out in the picture. But we don't want to do it to the point that we darken the features on the faces. About right there is good. We can also make the shadows darker, or we can brighten shadows so that, especially if on the face there are some dark shadows, like over here in this area, there's some dark shadows on the face, and we can actually brighten those up a little bit so that the lighting looks a little bit more normal. Here we can, it's kind of similar to the highlights, only instead of highlights, it just pulls down things that are white, whether they're really bright or not. Down here we can make the blacks a little bit darker. That adds a little bit of contrast, usually makes the picture look a little bit crisper. Clarity is something that I like to use, but not on the whole picture, but just in certain spots. We'll talk about how to do that in a second. When you pull the clarity down, you basically soften everything. This can be a great treatment for skin, to soften the look of skin, but if you apply it to the whole picture ends up looking a little bit fuzzy, and you end up softening things that you don't want to soften. As you can tell, this looks pretty weird. If you ramp the clarity up all the way, you obviously get something that looks scary. This is a lot of times if I'm taking pictures of things that are not animate objects and they've got scratches or a cool texture or something like that, I might ramp the clarity up on the whole picture to bring out the texture of it. But this isn't usually a good thing to do when you're taking pictures of people. And then we have the vibrance and saturation, so the purity and the strength of the colors. If you wanted to make this image black and white, you could pull the saturation down all the way. So let's talk about a few other things that we can do here. These are the main things that you're going to do, the main tools that you're going to use when you're adjusting a picture. But there are a few others that we're going to use. I'm going to grab the zoom tool and I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the faces. Now, remember I said that I don't usually use clarity over the whole picture. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this adjustments brush and I'm going to pull the exposure up all the way just so I can see where I'm painting. Now here I can adjust the size of my brush down at the bottom. Kind of doesn't make sense that it's down at the bottom. I think it should be at the top, but whatever. The amount of feather that it has, so how far it's going to spread out the effects. So the more feather you give it, the broader it's going to spread out the effects of the brush. And then the flow is kind of like the strength of, imagine it's like an airbrush, so the flow would be kind of the strength of it. So I'm going to just start to paint over the skin. Now you notice that my brush is, even though I'm touching around the eye, that my brush is not covering the eyes. And it's kind of avoiding the mouth area as well. That's because I have it on auto mask down here. When I have it on auto mask, it kind of tries to figure out what I'm trying to cover with the brush and what I'm not. And it's not 100% perfect, but I usually leave auto mask on. That way I don't have to be as careful with my brush strokes to make sure I don't brush over something that I'm not intending to. So now that I've applied my brush, I'm going to go ahead and pull this exposure back down because I only had it ramped up so that I could see where I was brushing. Now that I've got this area of her skin selected, I can customize the clarity only on her skin and not on anywhere else. So I'm going to pull down the clarity a little bit and soften her skin a little bit. I could do the same thing over here. Soften the forehead. Taking down the clarity can soften wrinkles, it can soften pimples or other problem areas like that. So now I've got it about where I want it as far as camera raw is concerned. Although if you wanted to crop it, you can crop it here. You can crop it when we open it in Photoshop as well. But this is how you use the adjustment brush tool. And you can basically apply the same things that you can apply to the entire picture over here, but you can be specific about where you apply it. So I'm pretty happy with the way that looks for now in Camera Raw. So I'm going to say open image, and it's going to open it for me in Photoshop. Now there are a couple of things that I'm going to do in Photoshop, and I'm going to first of all press Command J to create a copy of the background, because I want to make my changes to a new layer in case I don't like it. That way I haven't messed up the original background image. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is I'm going to come and get this sharpen tool, and I've got it at a strength of 50%. If you make it higher than 50%, it might sharpen things more than you want it to, but you can experiment with that. Also, I want my brush size to be around here, so that with just a few swipes I can cover the eye. I don't want it to be tiny where I have to sit there and scribble all over the eye, and I don't want it to be huge where it's sharpening things other than the eye. What I'm doing here is the eye is a little blurry, and I just want to make it a little bit sharper, including the eyelashes. And you can see the difference there. If I make this layer invisible, you can see the difference that increasing the sharpness has. I'm going to do the same thing to this eye over here. Just a couple passes with the brush ought to do it. And I'm going to do that with this guy's eyes right here as well. Okay, now another tool that I'm going to use is going to be the sponge tool. And I've got a smaller brush set for this one, because what the sponge tool does is it can either increase the saturation or desaturate something. And I want to desaturate the eyes, especially since we added kind of a warming filter to it. I want to take the saturation out of not the iris of the eyes, but out of the white of the eyes. And I also, a lot of times, I'm going to just do a quick run of desaturation over the teeth to get rid of any orangey, yellowy kind of look on the teeth. Now that I've done that, I'm going to come back, and instead of the sponge tool, I'm going to use the dodge tool. The dodge tool, again, you can adjust the power of it, but it's basically going to brighten some things. And I want to brighten the whites of the eyes, even the irises. Just going to go over them and brighten them a little bit. Do the same thing on the teeth a little bit. Just brighten the teeth slightly. Now, when we zoom back out, you can see that we may have done a little bit too much brightening. So what we can do, and this is another reason to create a second layer, is we can come down and we can bring down the opacity of the layer. See, that's what it looks like. That's what it originally looked like. This is our new layer. We can bring down the opacity to a point that is kind of a compromise between the two that we're comfortable with, that still looks natural. Okay, now you can see the difference here. It's just brightened and sharpened the eyes a little bit. Although I probably am going to come back here on the background and sharpen those eyes again. Just because I want to make sure that the eyes really are sharp. And the layer that I sharpened the eyes on before is now not as visible as it was before. It's got an opacity of 27%. So anyway, those are some of the main things that I do, adjusting the overall exposure or brightness of the picture, the contrast, some of the colors and things like that, as well as coming into Photoshop, sharpening the eyes, desaturating the whites of the eyes and the teeth, brightening the teeth and the eyes a little bit. And that's pretty much it. All we need to do from here is save it. You go to File, Save As, name it. There are a lot of different file formats that you can save it in. You use all of them for different reasons. For the most part, though, for photography, you're going to be saving it as a JPEG.